We have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case after all of these weeks, and if you thought that was the only major decision of the day, you would be wrong. We're going to talk about what happened on this absolutely monumental day in court.
The courtroom was silent, too silent. For weeks, the trial had been a storm, witnesses parading in and out, evidence boxes stacked like mountains, lawyers battling with words sharp enough to cut glass. But now, as the judge prepared to speak, the storm had stopped. Every eye was locked on one man, Sean Diddy Combs, the mogul who built an empire out of music, liquor, fashion, and influence, the man who thought he was untouchable, the man who had laughed at lawsuits, dodged whispers, buried scandals.
Conspiracy, not guilty. Sex trafficking of Cassie, not guilty. Sex trafficking of Jane, not guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Cassie, guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Jane, guilty. That was the historic verdict out of the Sean Diddy Combs criminal court today. A split verdict after almost 13 hours of deliberations and weeks of testimony and evidence and arguments. The 12 jurors acquitted Sean Combs of the more severe charges, the ones that carried the stiffest prison sentence, potentially 15 years to life in prison, but convicted him of the Mann Act charges, which, by the way, carry up to 10 years in prison each, although I will tell you in a filing today from the government, it appears the sentencing range they're looking for is 51 to 63 months, so 4 to 5 years. However, there is no mandatory minimum. So would the judge go lower? We'll talk about what the defense is asking for too. And also, whatever the sentences are, would he combine the sentences consecutively, one after another? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of questions, but I'll tell you what, you would think that the verdict would be just the only big part of today. You would think that's the only major decision. Not the case, because we got to talk about what happened later on in the day.
But today, the game was over. Today, there was no entourage, no PR spin, no music blaring from the speakers, just a cold courtroom, a weary judge, and the weight of justice crashing down. When the judge opened his mouth, the words that followed shattered everything. Diddy's face changed instantly. The arrogance melted into disbelief. His jaw tightened, his fists curled, because the sentence was harsher than he, or anyone else, ever imagined. This wasn't probation. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This wasn't a celebrity escape route. This was prison. Real prison. Brutal, long, and unforgiving. The courtroom gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Victims clutched each other's hands. And Diddy? He didn't stay still. He erupted. He slammed his fists against the defense table so hard that one of his lawyers flinched. His voice cracked as he shouted over the judge's words. No, no, this is wrong. This is lies. His screams echoed against the marble walls.
Today, by the way, sort of set the sentencing date. I'll talk more about that as well. But I mean, let's talk about Sean Combs. He's been locked up since September 2024. He's been denied bail at each turn. There was a change of circumstances here. He had just been acquitted of 3 of the charges. So could he make bail? We're going to talk about it. All right, so to discuss the hearing and more, let me bring on once again, hopefully not for the last time, but we're at basically the end of this case until sentencing. Joined once again by Long Crimes in Court reporter Elizabeth Milner. Great to see you. First of all, your reaction to the verdict. Is this what you expected? Because let's really briefly explain what happened yesterday. That, you know, we thought it kind of gave us a preview into what would happen today. Not necessarily so.
Yeah, I was not going to lie, Jesse, a little surprised by the verdicts in that I really kind of thought there was a really strong case for count 2, that obviously being sex trafficking as it relates to Cassie Ventura. And that was only because of the questions that the jury was asking when they were bringing some notes back. And that was kind of in relation to what had happened at specific instances that the government point out were allegations of sex trafficking. So I thought because of the tone that was inside the courtroom, the way the family was getting a little bit emotional sitting inside the gallery, even Diddy's demeanor, for the most part, we've seen him kind of really keep up his spirits. But yesterday was really a time where we kind of saw, I think, the weight weighing in on him, that it's possible a conviction on some of the more serious charges were going to happen. And so when the jury came back not guilty on count 1, 2, and 4, I was a little surprised, especially to count 2, but, I do respect the jury's decision. They spent a lot of time listening to this case, listening to all the testimony, listening to all the evidence, and that was the verdict that they had rendered.
Yeah. I wasn't surprised that they found him guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. We have been saying for weeks on this show that felt like a straightforward path to conviction. Wasn't surprised not guilty with Jane, given some of the gray areas of her testimony, but also the jury didn't even ask for one readback of her testimony or anything to do with her testimony, so it made me think they might have already been decided there. I was surprised about Cassie Ventura sex trafficking just because, like you said, the readback of that testimony, and then shortly thereafter, they came back yesterday and said, we have a verdict on that charge. So I thought they're convinced. And when it came to racketeering, I thought they were still going to be hung because they said they were at an impasse yesterday. It seemed like based on their note, there was no way that would change. The judge told them to continue deliberating. They come back today, and like in an hour, they come back not guilty on racketeering. I'm not really sure what that split ultimately will be. Maybe the jurors will speak out and we'll hear. Got to ask you about Diddy's reaction. Okay, so we have courtroom sketches of what it looked like. You were in there. What was his reaction to the verdict?
In contrast to the calm, deliberate tone of the judge who didn't even flinch, guards rushed forward as Diddy tried to rise, his suit jacket pulling tight across his shoulders as he lunged in frustration. Some swore he tried to charge toward the bench. Others said he just wanted to tower over the jurors, the very people whose verdict had sealed his fate. But either way, the image was burned into history, the powerful mogul, out of control, screaming as his empire crumbled in real time. The reaction outside was instantaneous. Live streams picked up his outburst and blasted it across every platform within seconds. TikTok flooded with clips, Diddy's face contorted with rage, guards restraining him, the judge slamming down the gavel. Hashtags erupted, hashtag Diddy down, hashtag justice for victims, hashtag the sentence. Newsrooms scrambled to cut breaking headlines. Cable networks interrupted scheduled programming. Spotify and Apple Music executives convened emergency calls to discuss whether to pull his catalog. Within minutes, the world had witnessed the fall of a giant. The mogul who once boasted about being untouchable was now screaming like a man.
And sooner, and one of the things that Sean Combs' attorney, Mark Agnifilo, had said was, quote, the mother of some of his children had passed away many years ago. These kids, the 2 daughters here sitting in the middle of Your Honor's second row, don't have a parent. Obviously referring to the death of Kim Porter in 2018, mother of Christian, Jesse, Delilah, Quincy. And by the way, remember Sean Combs was denied bail, so it wasn't even like he got to go home after the verdict. But clearly they wanted this expedited. They want his sentencing to happen as quickly as possible. They want him out of jail. They want him out of prison as soon as possible. And also it's interesting because prosecutors, they need time for the pre-sentencing investigation and report. Basically, that's when a probation officer interviews the defendant, looks at the history, the background, childhood, education, employment, criminal history, finances, the mental and physical health of the defendant. There are interviews that are conducted with family and friends. The officer looks at various court and school records, employment records, financial records. The officer could speak to the victims in the case, law enforcement that were involved in the investigation, provide all of this information in a report to the judge. Because here the judge is going to have a lot of discretion when it comes to the sentence. What could a sentence look like? Well, prosecutors indicated in a filing that before even doing a pre-sentencing investigation, Combs is looking at 51 to 63 months, a little over 4 to 5 years in prison. The defense seems to be pushing for 21 to 27 months, so a little over 1.5 to 2 years. But remember, Combs has been sitting in federal lockup since September at the MDC, so if he gets time served, he really wouldn't be spending that much time behind bars. Now, of course, they're the extremes. When you talk about transportation to engage in prostitution, the maximum for each count is 10 years in prison. You stack them together, you get 20 years. Okay, based upon the facts in this case, it seems highly unlikely he would get that much. Other side, you get the idea. There's no minimum for this charge. So could he get time served and walk free? Also seems unlikely, in that you're dealing with multiple instances of transporting Jane and Cassie, the 2 victims in this case, and men across state lines for the purposes of sex work. You could say this is an aggravating factor why I don't think
I'm cornered, powerless against the one thing he could never control, accountability. But how did it get here? How did one of the biggest names in hip-hop, the architect of Bad Boy Records, the mogul behind Ciroc, the man who threw white parties that became legendary, end up here? Reduced to tears and rage as a judge handed down a brutal sentence? The truth had been unraveling for years, but the trial brought it all into the light. Witness after witness described a pattern of behavior too dark to ignore. Contracts designed not for business, but for silence. NDAs that shielded violence instead of innovation. Surveillance footage that exposed private jets ferrying guests to so-called exclusive gatherings that turned out to be nightmares. Former employees spoke of orders to hide evidence, to clean up messes, to look away when the unthinkable happened. One assistant described nights where she had to check the hallways for blood before staff came in the next morning. Another revealed being forced to deliver envelopes of hush money to terrified young women who never resurfaced publicly again. By the time the trial ended, it wasn't just allegations. It wasn't just gossip.
Some even partook in drugs to prove their loyalty, or picked up drugs on Combs's behalf, or the many of text messages shown about drug costs, reimbursements for drugs, etc. Then another theme that played throughout the trial was the excruciating amount of testimony about domestic violence, especially during Combs's relationship with Cassie. I mean, we all saw the Intercontinental Hotel surveillance tape. We heard the subsequent apology after portions of the footage were released publicly. But we also heard about violence toward Jane, and Combs's former assistant Mia, and Cassie's stylist Deontay, and Cassie's former best friend Carrie Morgan. The defense even owned up to the domestic violence many times during the trial, something even the judge used as part of the reason to keep Combs locked up pending sentencing. The judge said during the bond hearing, at trial the defense conceded defendants' violence in a personal relationship, saying it happened in relation to Cassie Ventura and Jane. Judge Subramanian even pointed out there was violent and illegal conduct even after the HSI raids on his homes, saying that this highlights a disregard for the rule of law and a propensity of violence. But according to the report by TMZ, their source says Combs wants to use their jail programs to better himself. But there are skeptics of Combs' motivation to do the programs now. Is it too little too late, or does this polish him up for the judge so Mark Agnifilo can say in court, "Look, Your Honor, my client did these programs. He wants to be a better man"? I mean, I wouldn't put it past Mark Agnifilo to say that at the upcoming sentencing hearing. He said something along those lines of this when he was making arguments for Sean Combs to get bond after the verdict. Now, Combs reportedly started getting drug treatment before his arrest last year, even though the feds say he was found with drugs in his hotel room the night he was arrested. And Mark Agnifilo previously said Jane helped Diddy get into a batterers program before his ultimate arrest. We'll see if the self-work paid off, or if it's too little too late when Combs is ultimately sentenced in less than 3 months.
Well, I'm joined now by trial attorney Adante Pointer. Adante, always great to see you. Is it no longer Bad Boy for Life? What are your thoughts on these courses that Sean Combs is reportedly enrolled in? Are you buying that it's actually making him a better person, or do you think it's just trying to make him look better in front of the judge before sentencing?
Well, I think two things can be true at the same time. One is, yes, those courses are designed, they're instituted, they give inmates, if you will, access to those courses, because the belief is those courses will help, a person's behavior and curb them from doing things that would find them in front of a judge. I also could see that serving a dual purpose. Second purpose being, it makes you look much better in front of the judge. As I told all my clients, if you're doing things that the court can recognize that is actually helping you deal with the behavior that puts you in front of the judge in the first place. So here, violence against women, domestic violence is something that the courts is a big no-no in society as well as the court. And so I can see the fact that he's taking these classes being something that the judge will take into consideration during his sentencing. And on top of that, the drug class is the same thing, because I believe, if I was Diddy's attorney and given the way the evidence came in, I'd certainly be like, look, these things happen during dark times where I was in a drug, induced haze to where I was doing and acting in ways that I am ashamed about now. But during that time, it was because drug, sex addiction, and things like that I'm now addressing.
Well, you actually kind of sound like Diddy's defense attorney, Mark Agnifilo.
Proof. Hundreds of pages of texts, audio recordings that made jurors physically wince, financial trails that tied hush money directly to Diddy's accounts. It was overwhelming. It was undeniable, and as the judge read the sentence, it was clear: no brand, no net worth, no Hollywood friendship could save him now. The courtroom scene became instantly iconic. Diddy, veins bulging in his neck, shouted at the judge, at the jury, at the prosecution. His lawyers tried to calm him, begging him to sit down, but he refused. He pounded his chest, yelled about conspiracies, accused his accusers of lies, but the more he raged, the more pathetic he appeared. This wasn't the powerful mogul anymore. This wasn't the bad boy for life persona. This was a broken man, exposed, stripped of his armor. Cameras caught it all: his sweat, his fury, the spit flying from his lips as he screamed. And when guards finally dragged him back into his seat, the image was replayed endlessly: Diddy, powerless, defeated, begging for mercy that would never come. Outside the courthouse, the world was just as chaotic. Protesters demanding justice for victims cheered when the sentence was announced,
while he continues to live out the rest of his life. And so you can't slam the door on redemption. You can't slam the door on someone trying to address destructive behavior. So I think, he does get some kudos for enrolling in the program and for the efforts he made prior to finding himself in federal court facing all of those charges. So I think it does go to his credit, but you're right. Critics and skeptics, sometimes they'll just never be satisfied. And for, well-founded reasons. When you have someone who has a documented history such as him, and you see the videos and you hear the testimony, his problem goes deeper than a 30-day, program. Not that these programs are 30 days, but just to say it's going to take long-term and commitment to the long-term results in order for us to really have confidence that he's not going to engage in such disturbing behavior.
And it's interesting too, because I think the public reaction to this verdict was really kind of split down the middle. I was really thinking it was going to be one way. I was at the courthouse. It was a completely different kind of beast and animal that was going on after the verdict happened. There were people with the baby oil. It was a crazy day after the verdict happened. But I know some analysts were kind of comparing it to the O.J. Simpson verdict, but it seemed like the reaction was really kind of split down the middle. A lot of people upset with the jury's decision, but then there were a lot, surprisingly, celebrating the verdict. What are your thoughts?
Well, my entire time looking at the case, the charges, and listening, to the evidence as it came in during trial, I thought that depending upon how a person, be it a juror, be it the public, comes into the trial believing how someone who's a victim should act and how they believe relationships can evolve or devolve and fall apart is the lens that they would then make their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting. You don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what? That's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people,
fans who had once idolized him cried in disbelief. Some clutched vinyls and posters, unsure if they should throw them away or hold on to them as relics of a broken idol. Inside the industry, executives panicked. Calls were made to sever contracts, scrub credits, distance brands. Major fashion labels dropped him within hours. Liquor companies quietly scrubbed his face from promotional campaigns. One streaming platform reportedly debated pulling his catalog entirely, fearing backlash from survivors and advocacy groups. And in that moment, something bigger shifted. This wasn't just about Diddy anymore. This was about an entire system that enabled him for decades. Journalists asked the hard questions. How many knew? How many turned a blind eye? How many profited from the silence of victims? Legal analysts predicted a wave of lawsuits against labels, studios, and corporations that protected him. It wasn't just one man on trial, it was an industry reckoning, and it had only just begun. As the gavel slammed and the sentence echoed, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted into something almost surreal. Reporters who had covered trials for decades whispered that they had never seen anything like it. A celebrity of Diddy's stature, not just convicted,
Served as a clarion call, a wake-up call, canary in the mine, so to speak, as it relates to you could be as powerful, as popular, as wealthy as Diddy. I mean, keep in mind, he called himself Brother Love. He got the key to New York City in the months or the year leading up to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And he was sitting on what some might say is the highest pedestal. And look how far he has fallen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the same time, you have that going on. And so people can look, if you really look at the case, and not just the legal case, but the case in the court of public opinion. And victims, if you will, won. Because not only did he have a criminal case he had to deal with, but he has upwards of 20, 30 civil cases
I think
that
even
he's
more
also
than
going to have
that.
to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And each one of those cases, even if it's not proved by the victim that it happened, he is still going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees for each and every single case, and maybe millions for the more serious and those that get further down the line. So he's not done paying for his transgressions. And I think that for other people who are in similarly situated positions of power and influence, they certainly took notes from the Diddy trial and figured out, hey, if I continue to act like a pig, pigs get slaughtered.
Yes, they do. And I just remember even in the outcome of the Sean Combs lawsuits that were filed, even probably before he was indicted, we were hearing and seeing more civil suits filed against other people. And even after this case, we've seen more high-profile figures have complaints against them, like, Tyler Perry and Shannon Sharp and Smokey Robinson, all of which have denied the allegations against them. But I do think that a lot more people are willing to come forward, even if they're anonymous or even if they're willing to put their name out there too. But I'm curious, Adante, if you had a crystal ball, what are you expecting out of Diddy's October sentencing? Do you think it'll be kind of in the high max range or possibly on the lower end? I believe federal prosecutors are only asking for 4 years. The defense wants half of that, 2 years, possibly with a year of time served. So he could possibly be out next year around this time. But what are you expecting out of the sentencing?
Yeah, I don't see the judge giving him 4 or 5 years. If the prosecution asks for that time. So now that's kind of like the judge to go beyond that would have to find something that was aggravating in his mind to say, look, I'm going to give you more time than what the prosecution is even asking for. That doesn't happen, but it does happen at times. And it's pretty rare, but it's certainly something that's on the table. I just don't see that happening here. Instead, the judge could come down with a sentence, 2 years, 3 years. Diddy, by the time he shows up in court for sentencing, will have a year and a month in custody.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to get credit for that time. The judge could give him 3 years. That means he has about 2 years or so left. And then he could send him to a halfway house for a year and a day, and Diddy would be out with credit time served. So, I think Diddy doing the domestic violence program,
but sentenced so brutally, with such certainty, was unprecedented. Some compared it to the downfall of Harvey Weinstein, others to R. Kelly. But even those collapses felt slower, more predictable. This was different. This was explosive. It was the public execution of a reputation that had seemed invincible. And the symbolism of it all was impossible to ignore. 4 years, Diddy had strutted through the culture like an untouchable king. He was the man who coined phrases, who turned parties into cultural landmarks, who built empires on swagger and spectacle. But when he erupted in that courtroom, screaming, sweating, trembling with rage, the illusion shattered. It revealed what survivors had been saying all along. Beneath the glamour, beneath the champagne and silk suits, there was a man consumed by control, power, and violence. The judge's words cut through his tantrum like a knife. Calm, cold, deliberate. This court has reviewed the evidence, considered the testimony, and weighed the gravity of the crimes committed. This is not a sentence based on celebrity. This is a sentence based on accountability. And Mr. Combs, for the harm you inflicted, for the lives you damaged, for the abuse you perpetuated. This court sentences you to. The numbers that followed sent shockwaves across the courtroom. Years, decades. Enough time to strip away not just freedom, but legacy. Enough time for an empire to collapse completely. And while Diddy screamed, others in the room cried for entirely different reasons. Survivors wept openly, some clutching tissues, others clinging to each other in relief. For them, this wasn't about music charts or Forbes lists. This was about validation, about finally being believed, about watching a man who had haunted them for years finally face consequences. One survivor mouthed the words "thank you" toward the prosecution team. Another, shaking uncontrollably, whispered, "It's over. It's finally over."